going to let you take it away.
Okay, right. I actually have no idea what she has just said, okay, because I couldn't hear any of it. And this happened yesterday. She did this whole introduction and then she said, right, over to you. And I'm like, well, I didn't hear any of that. And she was like, oh, you're wonderful. Just get on with it, kind of thing. So I will. Okay, so and I'm just going to mute you guys. So if anyone says anything or you have a question, because I have quite a lot of feedback if I leave the channels open with you guys. So I've just muted you, which means I now don't have so much feedback. But if you have a question, you're going to have to like wave at me, or Monique is going to have to like get right in my face, as it were, so that I can know that you guys are saying something. And then I can unmute you. I don't know what she's just said, but I will kind of start. Yes, on Monday when we did I was about to say yesterday, on Monday when we did the first talk, I talked a little bit to start with about the difference between confidence and self-esteem, because both of these will affect really the way that you approach any kind of levels of anxiety, probably in most areas of your life, but especially in public speaking, which is obviously why you guys are here. And since that first talk a couple of days ago, I thought of a really good example to share with you guys, which I think will really, really demonstrate this difference. So a few years ago, the BBC in England, they ran a program called Child of Our Times. And they took a group of children that were actually, I think, born in the millennium. I have to work at saying that. And every year they kind of filmed them and they filmed their progress. And one of the programs that I watched, they did an experiment with these kids to be able to gauge how good their confidence was and also how good their self-esteem was. And so the experiment that they did with confidence, they took each of these children into a room with a parent, so they were very relaxed, very happy. And then they brought a stranger into the room. And at a certain point, the parent would leave the room and leave the child with the stranger. And their confidence was gauged as to how easily they could talk to this person. So most of the kids struggled a little bit, but kind of relaxed after a while. There was one little girl whose confidence was exceptional. She just chatted away to this complete stranger as if she'd known them forever. She was really eloquent, really, really confident, and she was rated as having the highest level of confidence. And there was one little boy who was rated as having quite low confidence. He was basically so shy that he hid under the table and wouldn't come out. I mean, that was it. There was no way he was going to engage with this person at all. Now, they then did a different experiment to gauge and to measure self-esteem. So the two things are very different. Confidence is something that we need when we are approaching certain things. We don't need to be confident in everything that we do, but we do need to be confident in the things that we have to do. Now, self-esteem is much more about how we feel about ourselves. So when they came to do the experiment for self-esteem, they got out one of these little jigsaw puzzles where you have the shapes are kind of cut out and you have to fit them in. But they had made one piece not fit, so that the children could not succeed at their task. So it was well within their capabilities, and all of them, of course, got to the last piece and they struggled. And then there was a certain point they gave them each an exactly identical amount of time to struggle in, and then they distracted them and they swapped the piece that wasn't right for the correct piece so that the child could then succeed in their task. And they then brought out a sheet of gold stars, and they asked the children to award themselves however many gold stars they thought that they deserved because they had completed the task. And most of the children gave them kind of a medium, they gave themselves a medium amount of stars. But really curiously enough, the little girl who was rated as having the highest level of confidence didn't give herself any stars at all. And she said, I was useless, it took me ages. And interestingly enough, the little boy who had the highest level of, the lowest level of confidence, the one that hid under the table, he was the only child who awarded himself the whole sheet. And he said, I was brilliant. It took me ages, but I did it. You know, so can you see there's a real difference here between confidence and self-esteem? And the one that will affect you most in your life is your self-esteem. People who have really good self-esteem will be able to develop confidence in the things that they need to develop confidence in, because just the fact that they've had a go will leave them feeling good about themselves. And if it takes them ages, they'll be okay about it. Whereas people with low self-esteem struggle to build confidence. And even when they do build it, they never kind of stop to celebrate the fact that they're good at something. They very rarely literally kind of stop and smell the roses. They don't acknowledge their achievements. They're always on to the next goal, the next thing that they have to get right. And they often have a really, really raging inner critic. So there's a huge difference between the two. And I asked the last group whether anybody, I'm just going to unmute you for a moment. I asked the last group whether any of you, how many of you are like familiar with the idea of an inner critic? Can you kind of wave at me if anybody knows what I mean by that? Okay, great, thank you. And I mean, I'm interested in a way because and I'll speak a little bit about something I spoke about as well on Monday. I'd like to talk a little bit about the power of words, because words carry emotion. You know, what makes words powerful is the emotional content. You know, when we listen to a series of words, what makes us feel passionately about what's being said, you know, you can get the nature of a conversation. If you're going to give a speech and you want your audience on board, you're going to need to engage with them at a level not just of mind, but of emotion. Yeah, I mean, words can be really, really powerful. So if I talk to you and I tell you how stupid you are and that you're rubbish, and that you'll never amount to anything and no one will be interested in anything you have to say, you know, you're not going to feel so good, or you're going to be pretty pissed off with me, or you might be justifiably angry, but I'm going to get an emotional response because I've delivered an emotional package. Yeah, words, the power of words sits in the emotions that they carry. If I sat there and said to you, you know, you guys are absolutely awesome for showing up today. You know, I'm really pleased to see you. It's been great that some of you have emailed me questions. You know, I can make you feel really good about yourselves, or I can make you feel shit. You know, the content of my words will carry emotion. Okay, so there's relevance to this in terms of your own ability to speak to your audience. But going back to confidence and self-esteem, we all have an inner dialogue inside of ourselves. We all have like those conversations with ourselves all of the time, sometimes far too much. And people with lower self-esteem often have a really raging inner critic. The language that they use with themselves, the words that they use with themselves are often really, really not very nice. To the point where some people, I would say, some people don't just have an inner critic, they have an inner bully. You know, they have someone who slaughters them before they've even got up. You know, nothing they ever do will be good enough. And it raises the hugest amount of underlying anxiety in anything that we try to achieve and anything that we approach. And it will undermine our ability to develop confidence, to have a go at something, to feel comfortable about making mistakes. You know, it influences our self-doubt. It influences whether after the event, even if we did brilliantly, we still go away and pick ourselves to pieces, because it just stops us from building any kind of steady progress in anything that we do. And as I said, it generates anxiety. So it's quite curious, that inner dialogue. I know some of you kind of put your hands up in relation to having an inner critic. And I'm interested, I actually did a public speaking course because I was quite scared of speaking in front of people. I was really worried about getting things wrong. And the guy that ran that course actually said, you know, if we spoke to our friends in the way that we speak to ourselves, we wouldn't have any friends. And I think he's right. Actually, on occasions, we're really not so good. So I quite like today to be interactive if it can be. I mean, can anybody here tell me, out of interest, whether are you nice to yourself when you talk to yourself? Can I have like a show of hands? Who's nice to themselves and supportive of themselves when they speak to themselves? Whoa. Like no one. Oh no, one person. I can see a hand. Good. I'm glad to see that. And so, and like out of interest, again, show of hands. How many people in your inner dialogue are not very nice to yourselves? Sometimes are you critical? Yeah. Wow. Cool. Do you not think that's quite huge? Really, that most of you, that's a predominant experience. You know, for me, this is really fascinating, but I guess backs up what I've come to know in working with so many people over so many years, that we all learn to be really, really critical. I think we live in quite a critical world. And the tragedy is, I think it kind of almost creates an epidemic of low self-value, low self-esteem, low confidence. You know, and yet to become brilliant, and by brilliant I don't mean in an omnipotent kind of all-powerful way, but to be the brilliant person that you can be, to be the best person that you can be, I think you need to feel supported. You know, I think you need to get good feedback, and not just from other people, but from yourself. You know, there's an exercise that I use with people in terms of getting them to consider shifting their inner critic to an inner critique. Okay, because there's a really big difference here. You know, a critic is critical. It's loaded with judgment. It's often loaded with negativity. If you get criticism, you're not going to feel good, okay, at the end of it. And that's going to sabotage the way you approach things in future. A critique is really valuable to you, because if you wipe out any aspect of critique at all, you have no opportunity for evaluation. You can't look at something and reflect on it and think, could I have done that a little bit better? How might I have approached this? A really good example would be me today. Okay, so I've worked very hard, because I honestly had one of the biggest critics you have ever met. You know, I mean, I really think I should be the queen of inner critics. I could really reliably slaughter myself when I was younger. Now, because I listened to the talk that I gave on Monday, I listened to it as a critique, not as a critic, but as a critique. And I kind of came away and I evaluated from that. So, and I thought, do you know, I wonder if I could have given an example that would have demonstrated that difference between confidence and self-esteem, and that might have made that even more accessible. Yeah. So that critique is what got me thinking. And that's when I remembered that example of that program that I'd watched. And I thought, well, that's one of the best examples I've ever come across. I'll share that today. So you guys, actually, being the second of these kind of talks, you guys have had the benefit of the fact that I've developed a critique inside me, not a critic, but a critique. So I've been able to kind of fine tune what I'm doing and take it that little bit more, you know. So rather than looking at something again and thinking, oh, I don't think I made that very clear, you know, I could have done that better. I've taken a non-judgmental approach, but I have still evaluated. So there's a really big difference. And I would really want you, I'd want to encourage you to develop that aspect of yourselves. The fact that you all have a critic means you can, and you do have the potentiality within you to develop a critique. What you're going to need to do is to remove the judgment. You know, and so a good exercise and a way of working with this, okay, is to, first of all, the key to everything in creating any change within yourselves is to learn to notice. Learn to listen to yourself above and beyond anything. If you can listen to yourselves, you'll develop the ability to listen to others, with a real objectivity and with kindness too, if you can listen to yourself with kindness. So first of all, notice, check in on yourself, and begin to be more aware of whenever that internal dialogue slides into the critic. Okay? Big golden rule: when you start to notice your critic, don't criticize yourself for criticizing yourself, because I've really noticed people do this a lot. And when I'm working with people, it's like, I did it again. I was criticizing myself. Criticizing yourself for criticizing yourself is kind of unhelpful. But learn to notice. And then listen to the language you're using. Don't just try and wipe it out. Because if you listen to the criticism, within that, there'll be a storyline. You'll often find there'll be like repetitive themes. And within those repetitive themes, within that storyline, you will be able to potentially identify where that critic originated from. Where that came from. Most of us in our childhood will have experienced things that left us feeling not so great. So you may be able to identify that. That's helpful because it means you can kind of put that down. You can recognize, that belongs in my past, not in my present time. So again, the awareness will enable you to do something with that. But as I said, always listen to yourself. And even if you can't identify where it's come from, write it down. And then imagine having someone that you really love and care about sitting in front of you, or maybe a child. And imagine how that child would feel if you just spoke to them in the way that you were speaking to yourself. And consider whether you would actually want to do that to another person that you care about, or to that child. Yeah. Then go away and rewrite what you wish to say to them. If you had a little child who just attempted to do something for the first time, and you just slaughtered them with the internal criticism that was going on in your mind, rewrite it. How would you encourage them? What would you say to them? How would you support them in overcoming any fears, any anxieties, any difficulties? And then take that on as a script that you're going to give to yourself. Yeah, so you're learning to reverse something. You're critiquing. And again, we're not, if a child has genuinely made a mistake, for example, we don't do them any favors by pretending it didn't happen. The way to help them is not to ignore it and pretend it didn't happen, nor is it to slaughter them. The key is to sit down and to acknowledge what took place and to help them to navigate their way through that, with kindness and compassion and real support. So, and that's what I'm talking about when I'm talking about shifting your inner critic to an inner critique. Okay, so that's a kind of an exercise that hopefully might be valuable. I'm seeing Monique. Let me unmute you. Right, you're unmuted.
Okay, so with the remaining time, it's probably a good time to open up for some questions, or if you wanted to go ahead and address the ones that you'd already received first.
No, I'm cool, because most of the ones that I've received came from the last class. I had a question from somebody about what kind of got me to write the book I wrote, and to be fair, I haven't subsequently checked emails, so my apologies for that, guys. If you've sent me something, I haven't in the last couple of hours checked.
No problem. So we'll just go ahead and
go ahead and go for it now. Yeah.
If somebody has a question, like for it. Great question. Situation that you think that you might be able to address for you, whether it's for this class or even outside of class. It doesn't have to be public speaking questions.
Notice that like a certain critique like an inner monologue is sort of based off of another person, like what they've said to you, what would you do to sort of change that? Would you try to talk to that person about possibly being kinder to you, or try to look at the situation whether you want to keep that sort of negativity in your life, or would you try to almost filter them while they're talking to you? Or what would you?
Okay, that's. I'm just going to mute you. So wave if anyone speaks, please. Okay. So it's a really good question. If we identify who someone is, this is very interesting, because it raises an issue of what I would call. There are two issues. One is what you do with what's going on inside of you, and one is what you do with what's going on outside of you, because none of us actually have control over anyone else. The person we have control over is ourselves. Okay, so I think in terms of the inner dialogue, if you recognize you have someone else's kind of repertoire in your head, you know, actually, and you know where it's come from, give yourself absolute permission to put that down. It doesn't belong to you. You have every right and every entitlement in any situation to work out your own opinion and your own position within that. And, you know, you are your greatest source of any kind of change. And ultimately, we would like you, or I would want you, to become your greatest source of inspiration. If you've got someone who's giving you a very negative kind of dialogue, I would really, again, maybe write it down, try and externalize it so that you can get a perspective on the fact that maybe that's not the way you see things. Now, in terms of externally dealing with that, if they are open to a conversation, that's fabulous, because you could talk to them about that. But some people are and some people aren't. You know, there's a reality. I would love to say to you, you know, everyone in the world is really fabulous, and if you go talk to them, everything will be fine. But some people are just not open to negotiation. They're very set in their ways, and sometimes it is because they are genuinely negative and critical. Sometimes it's because they believe that their way is right and they're trying to influence you, and it may even come from a source of love and regard, but actually it's not right for you, and you know it's not right for you. So there's a whole load of stuff around there. Again, look deeply at this, you know, take it apart a little bit, but try and do it with a critique and with some objectivity. Now, I have a little exercise that I give to people, which is really interesting in what I would call an evaluation. I call it a grading tool. So if between, I don't know, me and the corner of the room I'm in, if I created a line, and everyone in my world is on that line somewhere. Now, I think we have quite often the people that are close to us are there, maybe, you know, our close family and so on. They're there by default. You know, we haven't necessarily chosen to put them there. You know, actually, as we become adults, I think we have the right and the opportunity to choose who we bring close to us and who we can still keep in our world, but we keep them a little bit further away. Maybe we don't share quite as much of ourselves with them. So if I had somebody in my life who was extremely critical, I mean, for example, if I met somebody who was extremely critical, I might think, do I want them in my life at all? And if it was like a friendship over which I had absolute choice, and I really thought this is a really kind of negative and toxic person, I might just close the door on that. Whereas if it was, say, a family member, and I knew that I still wanted to have contact with them, but I didn't really like the way they kind of went about things and they weren't open to any kind of conversation, I would grade them a little bit further away. I might start to keep my conversations with them relatively superficial. I wouldn't share so much of myself, so I wouldn't open myself up to too much criticism from them. Do you see what I mean? I'd start to take charge of, effectively I'm taking charge of my boundaries, and I'm becoming discerning in my relationships. And it's a really interesting exercise. You know, there are lots of people in our world who are there by default, you know, our neighbors, for example, you know, people that are just around us. How much you choose to disclose and share of yourself in a way that would leave you vulnerable to their criticism to some extent, you have some choices over that. So it's really about firming up your own boundaries. As I said, differentiating between internal dialogue and kind of external sources of dialogue and criticism, and working out what you can personally do to empower yourself in both of those areas. Does that make any sense? But it was a great question. Thank you. Somebody put their hand up, yeah.
So like, what kind of advice kind of take for in the moment self-criticism? Like us in class, I know something that makes people really nervous is the doubt of them not doing good or them not doing well. You see what I'm saying? So
Okay.
like, what would you, like in a sense, what would you have to say to a person that like gets nervous to the point where it may affect their whole entire presentation? And like I know it really does bother a person to get up and like really speak in front of people they're not comfortable with. So it like makes them have that self-doubt. It makes them become like their worst critic.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm just going to unmute you again to avoid the feedback, or mute you rather. It's a really, really good question. Thank you. And I think that being nervous in the moment is really, really, really challenging. What I do always think there's a real value in always looking more deeply. So just as I've kind of encouraged you to notice and look more deeply if you have an inner critic, I'd also encourage you to look more deeply in that kind of situation too. Because I'd be checking out with you, what are you most afraid of? Are you afraid of being judged? Are you afraid that if something goes wrong in the moment, that's going to be a complete disaster and a catastrophe? Will it be irretrievable? Because in reality, lots of things that we are afraid of are what I would call, we're kind of afraid of the what ifs rather than how something actually is. A lot of us can build in our mind lots of fear of what if this happens, what if that happens. And I think there are ways, if we identify what our biggest fears are, the moment you identify a problem, within that, you have just created a window of opportunity to potentially look at solutions. If a problem remains kind of hidden, or if the root of a problem remains unhidden, we can't begin to find ways of navigating our way through that. Okay, so always in any situation, to be fair, I would say in any areas of your lives, always look more deeply and try and discover the source of a problem. So, I mean, I'm interested in a way whether you're afraid of judgment. I mean, I'm just going to unmute you. Can I ask you that? I mean, are you afraid of judgment? What's your biggest fear in those moments?
It was more of a general question, not really pertaining to me, but I would assume that one is afraid of judgment, especially from that they're not used to being in front of on a regular basis.
Right. I'm really sorry, but I had trouble hearing that. Can you shout at me, please? I'm having a little bit. It's because you're quite a way away. Or Monique, can you repeat that for me, please?
She's not talking necessarily about herself.
Okay.
But more about people in general who would be in that situation. So she thinks it would be more about how they're being judged. Being judged, yeah.
Okay, right, okay. Well, this is really interesting because we kind of spoke about this on Monday too. I mean, firstly, if we have a fear of being judged, okay, so expectation is a form of memory. Yeah, when we have an expectation of something, if you've always been treated really, really well, you will go into a situation, if you've every time you've spoken, you've been given feedback, good feedback, really healthy feedback and encouragement, and you've never ever been judged, and you've never had an experience of being judged or seeing anyone else judged, then you will walk into the same situation with the expectation of being received well. expectation is a form of memory. In our expectations, we can discover actually some of our past experiences. So most of us, I think, at some point, generally speaking, it's kind of part of life's journey. We probably have felt judged somewhere along the line, and we start to get anxious and fearful about again, being judged, being criticized. So firstly, as I said, look more deeply, discover what might be going on for you, because within that, you'll be able to begin to work out how best to support yourself through that. A really good way of tackling this, though, is to really show up authentically. You know, if I was going to do something and I was really worried about it, I mean, a really good example is, you know, you go into like workshops, and I call it the round of death. You know, when you're sitting in a group of people and you're going around with the introductions, and it's getting, you know, and the person before you has just said everything that you were going to say, and you're now thinking about what you're going to say. And, you know, you're being put on the spot. And there's an anxiety around it. There's a fear of exposure, of getting it wrong. Do you know, the one person I guarantee that we can all identify with in that group, it won't be the person that suddenly fluently talks about themselves in a really eloquent way. It will be the person who says, do you know what, I'm really nervous and I'm finding this really difficult. Yet that will be the person that we identify with. That will be the person that we probably want to align with the most, because they're being themselves, they're being real in the moment. So I would say, you know, we can build these things into our public speaking. We can talk about sometimes the way that we're actually feeling. We don't have to, like, you know, drown in it, but we can say, do you know, actually, I'm feeling really nervous about saying this, but I'm going to say it anyway. Or, you know, when you presence yourself, people identify with you. You're going to get people on side with you. You know, if you have something that is, let's say you're going to give a speech and you're a little bit worried about how people will receive what you're going to say, because you think it might be, I don't know, maybe it's a piece of really original thinking, or it might be considered to be confrontational, or you're going to deliver a subject for a debate, so you know there are going to be people who might sit in opposition to you. You know, just be authentic, presence yourself within that, and say, do you know, this is quite hard for me to talk about, because, you know, it's a subject that is very raw for me. It's a subject that's very real for me. But I really, really want to talk about this because I feel very passionately about it. That will make it much harder if somebody's going to judge you. It will make it much harder for them to judge you in a public way, because you've just shown up authentically. It makes it really, really hard. The more authentic you are, and the more real and the more honest, the harder it is for people to challenge you in a really critical way. Because in a sense, you've kind of got there first, not in a way that puts you down. You didn't put yourself down. You just presenced yourself. It's a really valuable tool. And if you're going into any situation where you feel you're going to be put on the spot, I'm a real believer in developing what I call stock answers, so I knew I was going to go into a confrontational situation with someone once who continually put me on the spot. So I kind of went away and I kind of worked. I developed a little phrase within myself, where, because I knew this was going to come, I knew it was going to happen, and I'd always flounder, and then it would make me feel worse, and then I'd get to the point where I was just dreading any of the meetings where this person would be present. So I rehearsed this little sort of saying in myself, which kind of went along the lines of, look, I'm really happy to answer your question, but I'm one of those people that really needs to think about things. So I'm going to go away and think about this, and I will come back to you. You know, it's really interesting. That just created a boundary. It meant that I couldn't be, you know, pushed to speak in that moment when I wasn't ready. And we can even do that. Again, there's some real authenticity in that. Even if you're speaking to an audience and somebody comes back with a question for you and they ask you something, you know, you don't have to bluff your way through that. Be completely authentic, be yourself, and just say, do you know, that's a really interesting point, but I need to go away and think about that, but I will come back to you. You know, leave your email address with me and I will reply later. People respect you for being honest in that way. You will gain far more respect, and again, and far less criticism, you know. And if someone ever does come back and criticize you, they haven't really got a leg to stand on. You're going to walk away from that feeling good about yourself. Your self-esteem will be intact, because you can walk away and you can say, well, you know, I've been completely honest with you. I've been completely upfront. I don't actually have that answer, but I will come back to you. You know, there's something really solid in that, and you create your own boundaries when you do that. You are being very authentic, very present, and it makes it very, very hard for people to judge you. You know, so it kind of acts as a defense. It consolidates who you are, and I think it builds your self-esteem, because you know in yourself, you know, afterwards, rather than coming away and thinking, oh, I really bluffed my way through that, that was shit, you're going to come away thinking, do you know, I really held my own in that situation. You know, when that phrase, hold my own, it literally means we hold ourselves, we are ourselves, we presence ourselves. And personally, I think that is at the core of being a really good, authentic speaker. You know, if you check in on any of the TED Talks, I love TED Talks. They're absolutely amazing. The people that really, for me, grab me are those that are so authentic. They are presencing themselves. You know, they're present in what they're saying. It's the real deal. And that is what actually, again, and because it's the real deal, it carries emotion. Their words carry power. And they don't carry power because they're a know-it-all, or because, you know, I mean, some of them are obviously amazing experts. A lot of them are just really real people presencing themselves with a voice. You know, and none of them are claiming to be perfect. If anything, most of them are talking about their imperfections and their mistakes and their failures and the difficulties and the way that they overcame them. You know, again, going back to critique and critic. As a golden rule, if your critique understands that your mistakes, a mistake is the cutting edge of your personal evolution. You know, it's where we learn the most. It's where we can become more than we were. Yeah, if you slaughter yourself for your mistakes, you won't learn anything, and you'll just feel bad about yourself. If you recognize a mistake as a learning curve and you always look for the learning, you will always benefit from every situation. Does that make some sense? My headset's sliding. Here we go. I'm muting.
Earlier you talked about the where girls have high confidence.
Can you come a bit closer so I can hear you? Sorry. Hello.
So earlier you were talking about the little girl that had really high confidence and really low self-esteem, and I feel like I can really identify, like, somebody I know is like that, and I feel like he has really high confidence and he sets himself up for failure, and then it just knocks his self-esteem even lower. So how do you approach somebody with that? Like, how do you tell them that that's how you feel they're being, and like help them with that, I guess?
Okay, cool. Brilliant question. Thank you. Really, really interesting when you're going to approach someone that you know is actually ultra critical of themselves. This is quite challenging territory, because you kind of know that almost anything you say might be then received as a criticism. So it's kind of like really about choosing your language and choosing your words really thoughtfully and really mindfully. And I mean, a very good way, I mean, actually, an interesting way of approaching that person might actually be, for example, to say, hey, I did a really interesting, I sat in on a really interesting talk today, and somebody used this incredible example about this little girl who had really low self-esteem and high confidence, and share that story. A sharing of a story means that we can identify with something without feeling that we're being pinpointed or targeted ourselves. So using a story is a good way, but I think actually always bring something back to yourself. You know, if you say to somebody, look, I really want to raise something with you, and I'm finding it's quite a tricky area, and I need your help with this because, you know, I really want to share something with you, but I'm worried about it. You've immediately got them on side. You know, taken ownership. You could say, you know, look, there's something that I notice in you. It resonates with me as well, but I'd really like to kind of share my thoughts. You know, open it up as a conversation. But there is such a difference, you know, between saying, look, you're this and you're that, or I think you're this and I think you're that, because we're immediately kind of like pointing a finger. And I think if you direct something at someone, they will immediately defend against it. You know, that's kind of human nature. I think it's probably science. Every force is met with an equal force, you know. And so when we use our words, which of course are very powerful, you know, if you don't want your words to be thrown back at you, don't throw them at people. I'm not suggesting you would. I cut you off screen, that person who just came up, but hello. I'm not suggesting you would in any way. And in fact, just the way you even kind of approach that would suggest a real sensitivity in your language. But I think that's the key. It's like, how can I open up an avenue of conversation? And if I can take an ownership of my position, then that makes space for the other person to take an ownership of their position too. You know, so as I said, I think people, if in any way you point a finger, they'll either criticize themselves, oh yes, you're right, I'm dreadful, you're right, you know, I get this wrong all the time, or they might actually just defend and push it back at you. So I would approach that as a skill. I mean, a life skill. Again, it's a wonderful negotiation tool in relationships. If you kind of really need to raise something with someone who's really close to you, actually take an ownership. Do you know, I'm finding myself feeling really worried about this, or I'm finding myself feeling really frustrated by something. Can I ask for your help with this? You know, I'd like to kind of explore what this means for me, because I find myself feeling really frustrated when I'm around you. Or you're taking an ownership, you're not pointing the finger. And it creates a very different dynamic between the two of you. It's like opening a space of negotiation rather than talking at somebody. You know, and again, even in your public speaking, this is a valuable tool. You're going to engage your audience, even if you're not in a situation where they're going to be able to engage with you directly. Your language will allow them to have their own space of thinking and their own dialogue, even if they can't speak it with you. Does that make any sense? Cool. I've unmuted. Monique, you were appearing.
So we're about to finish up here, and I wanted to give you an opportunity to give them some directive of how they may approach you with emails after class and about the videotaping.
Okay, absolutely. Yeah, if you think of a question afterwards that you would have liked to have raised, or if anything that I've been talking about kind of resonates with you in any way, you are really, really welcome to email me, and I will email you back. If you ever want to have a conversation, I have an online library. It's like a free public resource. It's something of a contribution, a personal contribution that I've chosen to create in terms of just opening these things up for conversation. I, from time to time, record conversations, much as I have recorded this one today. And if any of you wanted to engage in a conversation with me about anything specific, you're really welcome to. If you felt okay about it, with your permission, I'd ask to record it with the potential to put it in the library. Not because I want to expose anybody, but actually, do you know, most of the things that we feel and the dilemmas that we experience are really common with like just a ton of people. I mean, even if you think back to your show of hands around, you know, do you have, you know, a strong inner critic? So many people do. So when we talk about these things, it kind of gives other people permission to do the same. And so, as I said, you're welcome to email me, and I will always respond back to you by email. But if any of you ever want a conversation, or you have something that you think would be interesting just to talk about, and you would be willing to do that, and it could go into the library and maybe benefit others, you know, that's also an avenue that's open to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Jenny.